Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're jumping into something really fascinating, looking at the articles and notes you sent us. We're exploring a side of history that maybe doesn't get the spotlight it deserves, Shivaji Maharaj's navy, the Samudri Sena. So our plan is to unpack these sources together, see what really stands out about this powerful naval force. And there's a bit of a puzzle, isn't there? Why would a ruler known for land campaigns suddenly build a navy? And, who are the people who actually made this happen on the water? Let's dive right in. There's a quote in the material attributed to Shivaji Maharaj himself. It says, "Water is as important as land. One who controls the seas, controls the trade and security."
Wow, that one line just shifts the whole perspective, doesn't it? Tells you right away this wasn't just some small defensive thing. It was strategic, a priority.
Absolutely. And what's really interesting from the sources is getting into the why behind that thinking. The material makes it pretty clear it was driven by what was happening on the Konkan coast. It was a necessity. He was dealing with constant threats, not just on land, but from the sea. The sources specifically call out the Portuguese, the cities of Janjira, and later the British. These weren't small-time tyrants. They were established forces, controlling trade, raiding the coast. So building this navy, it wasn't just about playing defense. It was about grabbing control of trade routes, asserting, their presence, and stopping these foreign powers from just dominating the whole coastline, turning the sea from a weakness into, well, a strength.
Okay, so that's the why. Let's get into the how. How did he actually build this? Basically from nothing. It's not like he inherited a fleet. The sources mention a serious shipbuilding effort. What does the material tell us about where they built ships and what kind?
Yeah, the sources point to specific spots along the coast shipyards. Places like Kharwa, Malvan, Vijaydurg are named. And they weren't just building one kind of boat. The material highlights a mix. You had Gallivats, described as small, fast attack ships, then Gurabs, which were larger, sort of proper warships for bigger fights, and PALs, mainly for transport. So the key thing here is diversity. They built a fleet that could handle different jobs, not just a one-size-fits-all approach.
Right. And you can't just have ships. You need bases, places to dock, repair, shoulder them. What do the sources say about the infrastructure side of things?
Oh, it's crucial. The sources really stress how important the naval bases and ports were. They list key ones like Sindhudurg Fort, Vijaydurg Fort, Jaigad Fort, and Malvan. And these weren't just, convenient places to drop anchor. According to the text, these were proper operational hubs, supply depots, repair yards, safe havens. They were essential for keeping the Navy active.
Okay, and this is where the sources get really interesting for me, the sea forts. These weren't just walls on the beach, were they? The material describes some pretty incredible designs.
Incredible is the right word. The sources really detail these unique sea fortresses. Sindhudurg Fort, for example, built on an island. And the sources specifically mentioned its design made it almost invisible from the sea. Think about that naval camouflage back then. Vijaydurg Fort is another one, described with thick walls, a deep sea moat basically using the ocean itself as defense. And it even had its own dockyard inside the fort complex. They could build and repair ships right there, protected. Then there's Jaigad, guarding a river entrance, and Kharwa, which came a bit later. The point is, these weren't just forts. They were like integrated naval headquarters, command centers, safe bases letting the fleet operate all along the coast. A whole system.
So you put it all together, the ships, the ports, these amazing sea forts. What advantages did this give the Maratha Navy, according to the material we have?
The sources list several key ones. First, obviously, coastal security. They could actually patrol and protect their own coastline effectively. Second, control of trade routes. By making the sea safer for their ships, they boosted Maratha trade in the Arabian Sea, and they could challenge others. Third, attack capability. The fleet wasn't just defensive, it allowed for surprise raids on enemy ports and shores. The sources mention hitting the Siddis and the Portuguese this way. And finally, those sea fortresses themselves were huge assets, safe havens, strategic positions. And, the sources credit this whole effort as essentially creating the first Indian Navy in a strategic sense.
Makes sense. But building this kind of power, it must have led to conflict. The sources mention they faced serious opposition. Who were the main rivals at sea, and what does the material say about how those fights went?
Yeah, they were definitely up against established powers, the Portuguese, for instance. The sources talk about skirmishes, mostly fighting over control of trade and access to ports. It wasn't all-out war constantly, but definite friction. With the cities of Janjira, it was more like constant battles. The cities raided Maratha lands, and the Navy's job was to stop them. Then the British. The sources mention engagements aimed at curbing their growing influence along the coast, protecting Maratha ports and trade interests. And the Mughals, well, the sources note their navy wasn't very strong. but Shivaji's control of the coast basically blocked their sea movements anyway. So it was a mix of conflicts, sometimes defensive, sometimes about asserting control, reflecting the complicated power plays of that era, as the sources describe it.
Right, and this huge strategic vision, building the ships, the forts, it needed brilliant people to actually execute it. The sources highlight some key commanders. Who does the material point to as making this happen?
Oh, absolutely. The sources introduce several really vital figures. Mai Nayak Bandari, for one. He's noted as an early admiral, helped build the foundations. And what's really insightful is that the sources say he came from the Bandari fishing community. So he brought this deep, practical, local knowledge of the sea, the routes, the conditions. It shows Shivaji's approach, right? Using existing expertise.
That's a fantastic point, tapping into that local knowledge. Who else stands out in the material?
Daria Sarang. Listed as a senior admiral, apparently his name even means sea commander. The sources say he managed the fleets, was heavily involved in building Sindhudurg Fort, and led major operations out in the Arabian Sea, sort of the fleet coordinator.
Okay, and Daulat Khan.
Daulat Khan is another key sea commander mentioned. The sources credit him with helping in strategic planning, leading attacks, and really securing Maratha dominance along the Konkan coast. Looks like he managed the southern fleet.
And the builders. The forts didn't build themselves. Who is the mind behind those structures?
That would be Hiroji Ndukar. The sources highlight him as the chief architect and fort designer. He's the engineering brain credited with designing and building Sindhudurg and the other sea forts, including those clever features, like making them hard to spot from the sea.
Ingenious. And lastly, Tukoji Yangre.
Tukoji Yangre, mentioned as an early commander, served later in Shivaji's time. The sources note he helped with the transition, training, kind of bridging the gap, maybe, to a name that often comes up next in this story.
Ah, yes. The material includes someone who's almost a bonus civic, Kanhoji Yangre. The sources are clear he comes after Shivaji, but they include him because of the legacy, right? What's his significance according to the texts?
Exactly. The sources flag Kanhoji Yangre as, well, the greatest Maratha admiral. He really carried that naval vision forward and amplified it. He's credited with defeating major European navies multiple times, the British, Portuguese, Dutch. Quite a record. The sources even use this phrase that he ruled the sea like a Maratha pirate king. Really paints a picture of his dominance and how effectively he challenged the big naval powers of the day. So you see how all these threads of the vision, the ships, the forts, these commanders come together. The sources basically conclude that Shivaji Maharaj's vision, his foresight, was brought to life by these commanders. They're the ones who ensured Maratha power wasn't just on land, but extended firmly out onto the sea. It was that combination.
So, thinking about all this, why should you, our listener, care about this piece of history? What's the takeaway?
Well, I think it's just a stunning example of strategic thinking, isn't it? Seeing a challenge, controlling the sea, and building a whole new capability from the ground up to meet it. Adapting. And it shows how valuing knowledge, like the Bandari community's sea expertise, can be crucial. Plus, it's a story about challenging the big players, building something new that could actually stand up to establish global powers, identifying that need and finding the people and the ingenuity. So, to wrap things up, the material you shared paints this really clear picture. Shivaji Maharaj wasn't just a land ruler. He developed a sophisticated naval strategy, built a serious fleet, created the infrastructure, and found brilliant people to lead it. He effectively took control of the western coast and posed a real challenge to major European powers at sea. And, as the sources point out, that focus on sea power, that legacy carried on by his commanders, it really set a precedent. It laid a foundation, you could say, for how India would think about its coastal defense much later on.
So maybe a final thought to leave you with, based on these sources. Think about how radical Shivaji's idea, water is as important as land, must have seemed for an inland ruler back then. And how does that core insight, understanding that land and sea power are linked, still resonate today? When we think about global trade, security, maritime strategy, it's still incredibly relevant, isn't it? Something to ponder.